I froze when I heard my wife tell her friend on the phone, "I'm going to trade my husband for him," but I didn't let her get away with it. I recorded that audio. I didn't hesitate. I didn't sleep with that hammering in my head. I, who for years had been the foundation of a house built on promises and smiles, found myself reduced to a secondary role in my own life. I never imagined that the sound of a voice, so familiar, could become the blade that would tear apart everything I knew as stability. I listened to that as I walked back to the bedroom, with a glass of wine in my hands and a stupid smile on my face, planning our anniversary trip. While she, on the other side of the house, smiled on the phone as if she were talking about trading in an old dress for a new one, as if I were just another accessory in her life that no longer matched her social makeup. Betrayal never comes screaming. It whispers. First in the look that avoids yours, then in the rush to turn off the cell phone, in the perfume that is too strong for a lunch with colleagues, in the emotional absence disguised as tiredness. But hearing the confession, raw, direct, without beating around the bush, had the effect of a blow without warning. And even worse, she laughed. She laughed as if planning to replace me was the most exciting thing in the world. She said she was tired of pretending to be happy, that she had already chosen. That he made her feel alive, and that I was just comfort. Comfort. The word hammered in my head as if someone had written it with a hot iron on my skin. I was love, dedication, loyalty. And for her, was I just comfort? I didn't cry. Not at the time. The pain was so dull and dry that it froze my chest. But I wasn't passive. I wouldn't be. I recorded everything. That disgusting conversation. That quiet confession, filled with contempt. I needed that. I needed people to see what was behind that impeccable smile she wore in the Christmas photos. I waited for the right moment. But while I waited, everything around me crumbled in silence. I felt the ground give way beneath my feet every time she looked me in the eyes, as if nothing had happened, as if she was still my wife, as if she hadn't murdered me while I was still alive without a word. I would wake up in the middle of the night angry at myself for having believed every "I love you," for having planned a future with someone who had already discarded me. She would smile at breakfast while exchanging messages with him. She would put on lipstick to go to the supermarket and come back with that sparkle in her eyes that wasn't meant for me. And I, an idiot, pretended not to see it, because I needed to see everything with my own eyes, with proof, with certainty. Because my heart wouldn't accept, even when faced with the truth, that I had been replaced. The night I decided to act, there was something in me that no longer existed. I wasn't the same man who woke up early to make her coffee, nor the one who bought her flowers just because it was Tuesday. I was someone else. A stranger inhabiting a wounded body. I turned on the audio in front of her family during a Sunday lunch. Simple. Cold. Lethal. The table was full, laughter, silverware clinking, and then, her voice. Her laugh. Her sentence. The betrayal pulsating in every syllable. The silence that followed was the loudest noise I'd ever heard in my life. Her father, pale. Her mother, trembling. Her brother lowered his eyes. And her. She didn't have time to pretend. The mask fell all at once. No one recognized her. Not even she knew what to do with her own words coming back like poison. She tried to justify it, she tried to dramatize it, she tried to cry. But there was no defense. Not in the face of the cruel clarity of her own voice. The shame was too much for her body. The arrogance evaporated. And the lover? Ah, the lover, irony of fate. Days later, at the office, I discover that he is the new hire. The new employee. And what's more, that he is under my leadership. He looks at me, but he can't hold my gaze. I discover that he didn't even know who I was when he started with her. And now, he has to call me, sir, in every meeting. He has to deal with the fact that the man he tried to erase from her life now signs her reports. A lover turned subordinate, a woman turned into a public disgrace. Justice, sometimes, has a sharp sense of humor. The most painful thing, however, was facing the empty house. The empty pillow next to me. The cup of coffee that was left. The silence that used to be comforting, now became an accusation. I remade myself in silence. Humiliation cannot be erased with a click. But it teaches me. It made me see that the worst loneliness is the one we feel lying next to someone who betrays us in silence. I reinvented myself, day after day. And when I least expected it, between reports and non-judgmental glances, I met someone. Someone who didn't arrive like a hurricane, but like a breeze. Who didn't need exaggerated promises to show me that there was still life after the end. And now? Now everything has changed. She tries to come back, says she regrets it, that she realized her mistake. But regret after the fall doesn't erase the push. And what about her lover? He swallowed his own pride, keeps trying to prove his worth in a room where his name is remembered only as a footnote to a personal scandal. Life gives back. Slowly, but it does. And the most curious thing about all this? It's what happened at the last meeting between the three of us, when fate decided to play the final trick. A twist that no one expected. Not even me. What happened that day, between the three of us, sealed each of our fates once and for all. And to this day, no one speaks about it out loud. But those who saw it, never forgot it. Now tell me, are you ready to know how far this story went? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, encourage or romanticize cheating. All stories are fictional, but based on harsh and emotional realities, with a single purpose, show how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and marks lives forever. Get ready to dive into intense narratives, full of pain, twists and profound lessons. Take a deep breath. Because what you're going to hear now is shocking. Good story. When Anthony met Claire, there was a special silence in her eyes, as if the whole world had gone silent just to hear her breathing. They met in a cafe on a random weekend, the kind that promises nothing but transforms everything. He was reading a book he couldn't finish, she was drinking a coffee that was getting cold in the cup while watching people through the window. All it took was an awkward bump and an exchange of kind words for something to ignite between them, not an explosive fire, but a constant flame that warms with time. Anthony was analytical, calm, a man of routines and silences. Claire, on the other hand, seemed to be made of contrasts, sensitive and intense, rational and impulsive, with a beauty that didn't scream but remained in the memory. They were opposites who fit together for some reason that not even time could explain. The wedding came shortly after, simple and beautiful, like everything that makes sense. The first few years were a dance of discoveries and adjustments, but there was a lightness in their daily lives. Anthony always said that the most beautiful part of love was the silent care that one gave to the other. And Claire seemed to understand this like no one else. She quit her job at a bank shortly after their wedding to dedicate herself to the design studio she dreamed of opening, and he supported her without hesitation, even if it meant tightening his budget for a while. Their love seemed resistant to the pressures that crush ordinary couples. They had respect, admiration, and a partnership that extended from household chores to long-term plans. They weren't big on public gestures, but there was a visible tenderness in the way they touched each other in the hallway at home, the way they looked at each other between a cup of tea and a light laugh on the sofa. Friends used to say that Anthony was the safe haven and Claire was the wind that moved everything. She was the one who woke up in the middle of the night with an idea for a new project, and he was the one who kept her feet on the ground, never extinguishing the shine of her dreams. They supported each other. They were making plans to travel around the country, buy a bigger house when they had children, maybe 2, maybe 1. Anthony had saved every penny, and Claire already had names tucked away in the back of her drawer. They even had a little ritual on Sundays, making pancakes together, turning off their cell phones, and listening to old music while they shared their weeks, their fears, their small victories. That was love, in the most everyday and strongest sense of the word. Claire's studio finally came to fruition in their 3rd year of marriage. It was small but cozy, decorated with her hands and his technical advice. Anthony would stop by at the end of the day just to bring her a coffee, sometimes just to watch her work. He said that seeing Claire in his space was like watching the sun rise, silent and powerful. The clients started to increase, her name spread, and soon she was giving interviews in small portals, being invited to events and lectures on creativity and entrepreneurship. Claire blossomed before everyone's eyes, but especially before Anthony's eyes, who never stopped being proud. He liked to observe her from afar, admiring her intelligence and her ability to touch people without even realizing it. Despite their different routines, their relationship seemed stable. Anthony worked as a financial manager for a multinational company, with fixed hours and predictable days. Claire, on the other hand, lived between impromptu meetings, evening events, and clients who called at odd hours. But they met every night, even if only for a few minutes, and they made enough of that. When they couldn't sleep at the same time, they left notes for each other on the nightstand. Simple phrases, but charged with intimacy. "You looked beautiful yesterday. I thought about you all day. I dreamed about us in Venice." It was a way of maintaining the invisible thread that connected them. And it worked. At least, it seemed to work. Over time, came the small changes that everyday life imposes. The rush increased, the messages became more objective, the good morning kisses more rushed. Nothing that would set off an alarm, but enough for the silence to start taking up more space. Anthony missed the long conversations that lasted into the early hours of the morning, the aimless walks on Friday night. Claire felt it too, but silently. She didn't want to burden him with her fears or insecurities, because she knew he already carried his own burdens. They were a couple who loved each other, but who were slowly starting to stop seeing each other. The house where they lived was a reflection of this journey, organized, with corners personalized by her, paintings with travel photos and books lined up by color. Every detail had a story. The yellow armchair in the living room, for example, was bought at a bazaar during a rainy weekend when they were locked inside watching old movies. The vase on the balcony came from a craft fair, after a coffee where they decided they needed more plants and less rush. The kitchen, which had once been the scene of disastrous recipes and candlelit dinners, was now used more for coffee and the microwave. The spaces hadn't changed. It was they who had changed, even without wanting to. In the eyes of others, however, they remained the perfect couple. Friends envied them gently, family members were inspired by their photos and plans. There was something in Anthony's eyes when he spoke of Claire that was still genuinely in love, even if tired. And there was a sweetness in the way Claire looked at him when he didn't realize it. They both loved each other, but sometimes love also hides behind the things that life piles up between two people. Claire began to travel more for work. Conferences, design fairs, events out of town. Anthony said he understood, and maybe he really did. But he couldn't stop counting the days when he slept alone, when he prepared dinner and ate in silence, staring at the door. She, on the other hand, was trying to maintain her balance. He was afraid of losing what he built, afraid of hurting it, afraid of losing himself too. He knew something was off, but he didn't know exactly what. And I'd rather not face it. He blamed it on the weather, the routine, the demands of the studio. Anthony, always so focused, began to wonder if he was failing. I tried to make up for it with kindness, with patience, with shy surprises. But there was a point where his efforts seemed to hit an invisible wall. Claire was smiling, but it wasn't the same smile. I played, but not as often. She said she loved him, but her eyes, oh, her eyes didn't say the same thing anymore. And yet, the two of them carried on. They planned a trip for the end of the year. They talked about renovating their room. They argued about which series to start watching together. But something vibrated in the air, a tension that neither of them had the courage to name. There was a gap that grew silently between their routine and the feelings that pretended to be intact. No one shouted, no one fought. And perhaps that was the scariest part. There was no drama, no arguments. Just an emptiness that was slowly settling between the spaces that once belonged to love. The nights were longer for Anthony, who would get up several times and look at her sleeping. He wondered if she still dreamed about the two of them. Claire, on the other hand, spent more time in the studio, even when she didn't need to. She started going out with colleagues from events, having longer coffees with strangers who complimented her work. She felt alive and desired in a way she didn't know she missed. And she felt guilty about it. She tried to make up for it by coming home with sweets that he liked, kissing his forehead, but she was no longer the same woman. And he was no longer the same man. Everything seemed about to change, but neither of them knew when, how, or what exactly would happen. They just followed. With a love that still lived there, but no longer found space to blossom like before. And somewhere, at some point, that silence between the two of them was about to break. But until then, everything was still just appearance. Everything was still a disguise. Everything was still what it seemed. Anthony began to see the cracks more clearly in the weeks following their last wedding anniversary. Claire, who had always insisted on small, symbolic celebrations, seemed distracted on that date, as if the day had lost its importance. She came home late, with a convincing excuse, and with a hurried package that said more about the weight of obligation than about affection. He noticed, but said nothing. He just smiled and thanked her, while inside something fell apart. It wasn't the gift that mattered, it was the vacant look, the lack of enthusiasm, the rush to finish dinner so he could get back to answering messages on his cell phone that was vibrating every minute. This wasn't tiredness, he knew. It was something else. And it was silent. The late-night messages became more frequent, and with them, the trips to the bathroom with her cell phone in hand. Claire said she needed to review documents, respond to clients, but when Anthony walked into the studio the next day, there was no sign of any work in progress. The screens remained blank, the notebooks closed. He began to notice the small slips, the new perfumes that appeared without warning, the subtle changes in the music she listened to, now more sensual, less introspective. The bedroom mirror began to reflect a more put-together woman, even when the day called for comfort. There were smiles that no longer belonged to him, and gestures that did not reach him. He tried to hold on to what he still had, trying to rekindle something that was perhaps just dormant. He planned a weekend away, without telling her, in an attempt to recapture the freshness of other times. He rented a cozy cabin, prepared a playlist with songs that marked their history, and chose a special wine. Claire smiled when he told her the surprise, but it took a second longer for the smile to appear and it didn't touch her eyes. She claimed an unpostponable commitment, a last-minute client who demanded her presence at an event. Anthony didn't insist. He just stored everything back in his memory like a refused gift. Deep down, he already knew something was going on, but part of him resisted the truth. Part of him still believed it was just a phase, that everything would soon go back to normal. The emotional distance began to hurt more than any physical absence. Affection had become mechanical, kisses were rare, sex had become sporadic, almost protocolary. When they made love, Claire seemed distant, her eyes closed as if searching for another place, another face. Anthony, even noticing, didn't comment. The fear of confirming what I already suspected was greater than the pain of doubt. I preferred silence to the certainty of a breakup. And Claire, in turn, said nothing because she was clinging to her own confusion. She didn't want to destroy what they had built, but she also couldn't ignore what she was beginning to feel for someone who had appeared by chance, with an innocent conversation at a random event. The approach began almost imperceptibly. A new supplier, young, charismatic, sweet-talking and engagingly argumentative. A man who admired her in a different way, who saw in her a power that Claire no longer saw reflected in Anthony's eyes. Professional meetings started to become personal. An extra coffee after the meeting, an exchange of messages at the wrong time, a subtle compliment about how she dressed or how she ran her business. Claire felt alive, wanted, rediscovered. And for a moment, he forgot that fire wasn't so different from the one he had once felt for Anthony. The messages evolved into videos, long audios, intimate conversations. He made her laugh, listened to her slowly, praised her intelligence, her body, her courage. Claire resisted for weeks, fighting the guilt that crept in like a shadow. But one night, after an event where Anthony couldn't accompany her, she accepted his invitation to dinner. She told Anthony that she would sleep at a friend's house who lived nearby, to avoid driving tired. He believed her. And she went. The restaurant was discreet, the wine was good, the conversation flowed naturally. And when his fingers touched hers on the table, Claire didn't flinch. In that moment, she stopped being a wife. And she went back to being a woman, at least in her own narrative. The kiss happened outside, under the light rain of a warm evening. He was not impulsive, nor was he forced. It was the result of weeks of accumulated tension, of exchanged glances, of unspoken words. Claire knew what she was doing. He knew that by letting himself go, he was crossing a line from which there was no going back. And yet, it continued. They went to a hotel. A reserved place, known for being discreet. There, she stripped herself not only of her clothes, but of everything that connected her to her previous life. For the first time in years, she felt young, invincible, desired to the point where she didn't need to hide anything, at least not that night. Anthony, that same night, slept alone. He waited for a message that never arrived, called twice with no answer. He made tea, sat on the balcony, and reread old messages on his cell phone. He looked for signs that there was still something there. He relived moments that now seemed too distant. And then, as if guided by an ancient instinct, he accessed Claire's computer. The same one where she used to leave her studio email open. I was looking for proof that I was wrong. I wanted to find a client receipt, an actual schedule that would justify the absence. But he found an email sent hours earlier, either by mistake or by distraction. An attached audio, carelessly named. As it clicked, Claire's voice boomed into the silent room. She laughed. She told her friend that she was experiencing something new. That he would trade Anthony for him, that it was just a matter of time before he admitted what he felt. The naturalness with which he spoke about the replacement, as if he were just a piece of furniture that could be exchanged for a more modern one, made him tremble. It wasn't just the physical betrayal. It was contempt. It was the trivialization of a life built by two. It was the fact that she had already decided to move on without him, and everything he believed himself to be, everything he stood for, had already been discarded without warning. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He sat on the floor and listened to the audio once more. So you saved the file in several folders, sent it to yourself. I knew I would need it later. In the days that followed, Anthony remained silent. He continued playing his role as if nothing had changed. I watched. I reviewed every gesture, every expression. And something inside him was erased with each new lie Claire told. He began to write down the times, the excuses, the places mentioned. His pain turned into strategy. And the more he heard that phrase echoing in his head, "I'm going to trade my husband for him," the more the certainty grew within him that he wouldn't let that go unnoticed. That he would not be reduced to a supporting role in his own story. But he also knew that there was something more to that betrayal. Something she didn't say. A detail that Claire hid even from herself. A secret he couldn't yet understand, but was about to discover. And when that came to light, everything would change. The plan was ready. The mask, hanging by a thread. And the moment to tear it apart was getting closer and closer. The day Anthony chose to expose Claire was no accident. He waited for a date when he knew her entire family would be present, a lunch in honor of her grandmother who was celebrating her 90th birthday. An important event, with uncles, cousins, and brothers that I hadn't seen for a long time. Claire got ready calmly that morning, wore a blue dress he always complimented, put on a new perfume, and casually asked if he was okay. He said yes with a calm smile and held her hand on the way to her mother's house. It was strange how she could still pretend, how she could still touch his arm and say, "You look beautiful," knowing what she had said behind his back. When they arrived, they greeted everyone, and Anthony was kind to each one, as always. But in the inside pocket of his jacket, his cell phone carried the audio, the one he had heard dozens of times, the one that had changed everything. The perfect moment came when Claire's father asked for a toast to the longevity of love, speaking of the importance of trust, companionship and respect. A simple speech, but one that resonated with pure irony in Anthony's ears. When the applause died down and everyone was still holding their glasses, he stood up, saying that he also had something to share. He turned on the Bluetooth on the speaker, connected his cell phone and, with his eyes fixed on hers, pressed play. Claire's voice filled the room, laughing on the phone, saying clearly, "I'm going to trade my husband for him," followed by a mocking comment about how Anthony no longer made sense, how the new man was different, more ambitious, more virile. The silence was absolute. There was no chewing, no sighs. Just wide eyes, half-open mouths and Claire standing still, with her trembling hands resting on the tablecloth. She stood up suddenly, shouting his name in the middle of a, "Are you crazy?" asking him to turn it off, so he wouldn't expose her like that. But the damage had already been done. Her brother stood up slowly, saying he needed air. Her mother lowered her head, embarrassed, and her father simply turned his face away, unable to look at his daughter. Claire tried to justify herself, saying it was a joke, that everything had been taken out of context. But the audio continued, showing that there was no context that could save her. When it was over, Anthony took a deep breath and simply said that he didn't expect anything more from there, turned to leave, but was stopped by a voice coming from the other side of the room. A tone he recognized immediately, even though he had never heard it a few days ago. It was the man she had cheated on him with. And in that moment, the whole world changed once again. Anthony would never have guessed. The man who stood up, embarrassed, trying to apologize, was his new subordinate, recently hired by the company where Anthony had been a manager for years. A professional who had come from another city with high recommendations and an impressive resume. He had been on the team for 3 weeks, and in a cruel irony, Anthony had mentored him during that time, introduced him to the team, championed him in meetings, recommended his name for an important project that would lead to promotions next quarter. Anthony's eyes fixed on his as if reality suddenly lost all logic. Claire didn't know. I had no idea who he was. She had simply fallen in love with a man who complimented her performances, who made her feel desired, but completely ignored the bond between them. The lover tried to explain himself, saying he didn't know she was married, much less that she was his superior's wife. Anthony didn't answer right away. He looked at Claire, who seemed smaller by the second, and then looked back at him. He simply said that now everything made sense. The disappearance of the intern who worked directly with this new employee, the averted glances in the hallways, the late messages, the comments among colleagues that there was something strange in certain meetings. Anthony felt his heart beat as if it were trying to burst through his chest. It wasn't just his wife's betrayal. It was the fact that all of this had happened within his professional environment, before his eyes, with someone he had trusted professionally. The level of humiliation reached a level that was difficult to measure. Claire was crying now, no longer from guilt, but from terror. The lover, pale, kept his eyes lowered. But Anthony still had something to say. He asked for silence and revealed that he had done more than just listen to that audio. You will discover messages, videos, hotel dating histories, reservations made in someone else's name. He said he had hired a professional to follow Claire for the past few weeks and that he had all the evidence documented. She collapsed into the chair. He tried to deny it, to say it was a mistake, but Anthony opened the tablet and projected dated photos, with times and locations, onto the living room television. There they were, together, smiling, going into restaurants, hotels, events where she said she was working alone. There was no way to contest it. What Anthony didn't expect, however, was what came next, the secret behind the betrayal. The reason Claire had given up so quickly, the real reason behind the rush to replace him. And this detail, this last piece, was what was missing for the story to stop being just a betrayal and become a cruel twist. The lover swallowed hard, looked at Claire with teary eyes, and then, looking at Anthony, said he needed to tell her something she had never had the courage to say. He apologized again, said he didn't want to get involved, that everything happened too quickly, but that there was a very specific reason why Claire had approached him. Something that had nothing to do with love or desire, but with history. He said it all started when he received a notification from the company informing him of the name of his new supervisor. And when he read Anthony's last name, he was shocked. The name was the same as a man he had been trying to locate for years. The man responsible for taking everything from his father in a poorly resolved financial transaction. A name he grew up hearing with hatred. A name that his mother, now hospitalized with dementia, repeated in delirium as a symbol of what destroyed her family. He said he tried to find out more, that he found Claire on social media, that he recognized her as Anthony's wife, and that he approached her on purpose. That he seduced her not only out of attraction, but out of revenge. Anthony stood still. The entire environment seemed to be suffocating. The people around no longer knew whether to look, whether to leave, whether to comfort Claire, whether to protect Anthony. Claire, in tears, begged him to be quiet. But the lover followed. He said that, over time, he ended up falling in love for real, but that in the beginning, everything was calculated. Who knew who Anthony was before he even stepped foot in the company? And Claire, upon discovering this, did not back down. Who, on the contrary, saw it as a way to punish him for something he had kept silent about for years. And it was then that Anthony understood what was before him. The real weight of betrayal. The wife he loved had not only left him for another, but she had done so knowing who that man was. And what's more, he hadn't told him because he wanted to see him suffer. Because there was an old hurt, a hidden resentment, something that was not yet clear, but that she carried in silence. And by allowing all of that, she not only betrayed her love, but destroyed the deepest foundation of trust. Anthony didn't scream, he didn't cry, he didn't punch walls. He just looked into her eyes and, in a firm voice, asked, "Why?" Claire tried to respond, but her voice cracked. And at that moment, he realized there was more to come. That the secret, the one that would change everything, was yet to be revealed. And when he came, he would leave no stone unturned. The silence after Anthony's question hung like a thick, heavy fog. Claire looked down, her eyes red and her body hunched as if carrying a guilt that only now weighed completely upon her. The lover remained standing, restless, like someone who had said more than he intended, but who could no longer go back on his word. The guests at the family gathering had begun to disperse in silence, embarrassed, as if the air inside had become unbreathable. Anthony didn't expect any more explanations, didn't ask for any more justifications, but something in his voice, when he repeated once more, quietly, the same question, "Why?" carried such a painful echo that Claire knew she could hide it no longer. What he deserved now was the truth. Whole. Raw. And hurt. She asked everyone to leave the room, to leave them alone. The parents looked at each other, hesitated, but ended up leaving in silence. The lover remained for a few moments, until Anthony lifted his chin and pointed to the door. When they were alone, Claire finally looked up. He took a deep breath. And then he began to speak. Not with the confident voice of someone trying to save themselves, but with the broken tone of someone who knows they have already lost everything, and yet still needs to tell the last part of the story. He said there was something he had been holding back since the beginning of the marriage. Something he never had the courage to say, that he pretended didn't matter, but that had been eating away at his chest since the day he signed his surname for the first time. The secret was linked to her father. And to the company where Anthony had built his career. She said that many years ago, her father had been a partner with Anthony's father. A partnership that had ended bitterly, with accusations of mismanagement, hidden debts, and sudden bankruptcy. Her mother told the story as a family tragedy. They said that Anthony's father had manipulated the balance sheets to avoid responsibility and shifted all the blame to his partner, ruining his reputation, his credit, and his dignity. He spent the last years of his life trying to prove his innocence, but he died before he could clear his name. Claire grew up hearing this as a trauma. She had no proof, no documents, but she carried an emotional truth in her heart: the Trentons, Anthony's last name, destroyed her father. And no matter how much she fell in love, no matter how much she built a home, that past never stopped living in the depths of her soul. Anthony listened silently. His face was impassive, but his eyes betrayed his inner turmoil. He knew the story of the bankruptcy, but he had always heard another version, that his father had been betrayed by a greedy partner who tried to withdraw funds from the company to pay personal debts. He never had any proof either, but he believed the version in his own blood. Claire continued. He said that, at first, he didn't know he was the son of that man. He only found out when they were already together, and he hesitated. Thought about ending it. But love spoke louder. But he never managed to erase the stain. And when she met her lover, the son of the woman who had also been a victim of the same story, she felt something ignite inside her. It wasn't just desire. It was identification. It was as if, together, they were avenging the past. Only later came the passion, the mistake, the guilt. But the beginning was marked by a sense of justice. To give back to destiny a piece of what had been taken from her. Anthony walked away slowly, as if her presence was now burning. He walked to the balcony, opened the glass door, let the afternoon wind in, and for a moment, closed his eyes. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. That changed everything. The betrayal wasn't just emotional or physical. It was ancestral. It was as if he had been punished for something he hadn't done. And that hurt more than anything. He went back inside, looked at Claire with a blank look and asked if she had already planned everything. If she had approached him with this goal in mind from the beginning. She denied it, said she loved him, that everything they had experienced was real, that she never wanted things to get to that point. That the pain of the past had only created cracks through which resentment had entered, and that she didn't know how to expel it. She said she had lost herself. Anthony did not respond. He just walked away. He left without saying where he was going. He walked the streets like a ghost. He felt betrayed not only by the woman he shared his life with, but by history itself. The idea that he had been a piece on a larger board, where old grudges had determined his fate, sickened him. She spent the night in a cheap hotel, sleeping poorly, waking up gasping for breath, revisiting every memory with Claire now in a new light. The next day he didn't come home. Went straight to the company. He requested a meeting with the board and handed in his resignation. He said he needed time, that he could no longer work in an environment where everything reminded him of pain. The departure took everyone by surprise. His prestige there was immense. But he didn't explain. It just was. In the following weeks, Anthony cut off contact with everyone. Changed number. He left social media. It disappeared. Claire tried to look for him. He sent messages that went unanswered. He went to his parents' house, but no one knew his whereabouts. The lover, in turn, was fired. Not officially for betrayal, but for breach of professional ethics. He left with his tail between his legs, and later learned that Anthony recommended his dismissal with an impeccable technical report, impossible to dispute. Claire lost everything. The admiration of the family, the respect of the market, the man she loved. He tried to rebuild the studio, but customers started to disappear. People commented. The story spread as it always does in small neighborhoods. She found herself alone, carrying a name now associated with shame. Meanwhile, Anthony wandered around. He was seen in nearby towns, in discreet coffee shops, in old bookstores. He didn't talk to anyone. He just read, wrote in notebooks, observed the world with different eyes. The mourning he carried was more than for his wife. It was for himself. For the naivety he had lost. For the peace that would never return. One day, without planning it, he entered a small art gallery. He just wanted to escape the rain. There, he found an exhibition of photographs. Portraits of anonymous faces, in black and white, with poetic captions. In a corner, a woman observed the works with a notebook in her hands. She was discreet, with her hair tied up and a serene look. When Anthony approached, she smiled. Not that flashy, automatic smile, but a real smile, like someone who sees the pain in another and recognizes it. They exchanged a few words about art, then about the rain, then about life. Without realizing it, they spent hours talking. There were no promises, no intentions. Just two strangers recognizing each other in pain. Her name was Elena. She was a photographer and had also survived a marriage that ended in ruins. The connection was natural. There were no games, no artificial enchantment. It was just light. And Anthony, for the first time in months, felt safe taking a deep breath. In the days that followed, they met again. First by chance, then by choice. They didn't touch each other. They didn't kiss. But there was something there that warmed, that healed slowly. Claire, upon learning from third parties that Anthony had been seen with another woman, attempted one last contact. He wrote a letter. In it, he asked for forgiveness, not for having loved another, but for having let the past define his future. He said he never meant to hurt him, but he understood that it didn't make a difference now. And if one day he forgave her, even from afar, she would be grateful. Anthony read. He folded the letter. And he didn't answer. Because sometimes forgiveness doesn't need to be said. It just needs to be lived. And at that moment, he began to live another story. Not that of a betrayed man, but that of someone who survived the worst and chose not to become like the pain he received. He chose to start over. Chose to love again. Even if slowly. Even if scared. But he chose. And that was all. The days that followed the storm did not bring immediate calm. They just opened up the ruins left behind. It was as if, after the fire, the smoke took a long time to dissipate, making it difficult to see what was really left. Anthony, even after he had moved away from everything, still felt Claire's presence in details he couldn't control, a song that played randomly, a specific aroma on the street, a type of tea he saw on the supermarket shelf that only she usually drank. These were not painful memories because they reminded me of love. They were painful because they reminded us of the farce. He didn't miss what was. I felt angry at what I believed I was. The pain was no longer as intense as it had been at the beginning, but had become chronic, silent, installed in deep layers, the kind that doesn't scream, but weakens. And the worst part, sometimes, I still dreamed about her. He dreamed of Claire who once existed, or who he believed existed. The woman who made him feel safe, who made him believe that love was enough. He woke up sweating, confused, with the feeling of having been betrayed again just for having allowed her back into his mind. Meanwhile, Elena approached. She didn't invade, she didn't demand. She was just there. With her easy way of listening, with her welcoming silences and her questions that didn't demand answers. Anthony felt seen, but not pressured. He felt he could be himself, without masks, without having to prove himself or hide cracks. They began to share small rituals, coffees on Saturday mornings, walks by the lake, spontaneous trips to exhibitions or local fairs. There was no rush between them. It was as if they both knew that any misstep could reopen wounds that were still healing. Elena understood this. She had her own scars. She spoke little about her ex-husband, but when she did, she made it clear that she knew well what it felt like to rebuild yourself with your own hands, day after day, in silence, while the world believed you should have moved on. One day, while they were walking together along a tree-lined street in the late afternoon, Anthony found himself faced with an unexpected dilemma. Elena invited him to see the house where she lived, a modest cottage, but full of details that revealed her sensitivity: black and white paintings taken by herself, books scattered everywhere, plants hanging from the windows like green arms embracing the light. When he entered, he felt comfortable, as if that place had been built to welcome souls in transition. They sat on the sofa and, for a while, said nothing. They just listened to the soft music that filled the room. Then Elena looked at him and, with a shy smile, asked if he could trust again. Anthony hesitated. Not for lack of will, but for fear of betraying himself. And that was when he understood the real dilemma: to forgive Claire, even silently, in order to be able to love someone again. Not for her, but for him. Because as long as anger still made its home in his chest, there would be no room for anything new. That same week, Claire reappeared. Not personally, but through a mutual friend who, without asking, gave him a handwritten letter. Anthony didn't know whether to open it. He spent 2 days with the envelope on the table, not having the courage to face it. Until one morning, without thinking too much, she broke the seal and began to read. Claire didn't beg. It wasn't even justified. It just counted. It revealed in detail what she had felt since he left. He spoke of loneliness as a just punishment. He said he didn't expect reconciliation, but that he needed to say what he never had the courage to say, that he always knew that the resentment against his family was an unhealed wound. That, even though she had genuinely fallen in love, she never worked through that resentment. That somewhere deep down, she still wished he would pay for the pain that wasn't his. And that when the opportunity arose, not planned, but served by chance, it was weak. He said he would carry that guilt forever. And that, despite everything, she hoped he would find someone who would see him like she was unable to do. That she would be loved back with the same intensity. And that, this time, he would not be betrayed by a past he did not choose to carry. Anthony finished the letter with his eyes fixed somewhere in the room. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. Just took a deep breath. For the first time, he felt that Claire had said something true. It didn't change the facts. But it put a full stop where before there had been only an ellipsis. He kept the letter in a drawer, not because he wanted to remember, but because he knew that forgetting was also a way of denying who he had been. And he didn't want to erase his own history. I just wanted to be free of her. He went to the park where he used to walk with Elena and found her sitting on a bench, photographing falling leaves. He sat down beside her and, for the first time, took her hand firmly. She looked at him and understood. He didn't ask anything. He just smiled, and that gesture, simple and without promises, was enough to say that they were ready to start over. Meanwhile, Claire tried to move on. There was no new romance, no relaunched career. Just everyday life. She took care of her mother, who was now weaker, visited few friends, and kept the studio running modestly. She was a different woman. Not because of the pain, but because of the awareness of what she had caused. Sometimes she thought of Anthony and wondered if he was okay. If he had smiled again without it hurting. If he had found someone who would make him forget the weight she had placed on his shoulders. But she no longer tried to find out. Because she had understood that part of redemption came from silence. From not interfering. From accepting that some forgiveness is invisible but fundamental. She did not expect redemption. She only expected peace. Time passed. Anthony and Elena began to share more than coffees and walks. They planned a little trip together, and he found himself, for the first time, excited about the future. There was life there. There was a possibility. And above all, there was a lightness he never thought he would feel again. It wasn't overwhelming passion. It was presence. It was constancy. It was that thing that, after the storm, makes the ground feel safe again. One night, looking at Elena as she slept, Anthony understood that love doesn't need to be shouted to be real. That sometimes it arrives silently, after everything has been devastated, like a flower growing among the rubble. And in that moment, he realized he was finally ready. Not to forget what you lived through. but to make sense of what would come next. Because a true new beginning is not one that erases the past. It's what you learn to walk with it without letting it weigh you down too much. And so, faced with this new beginning, there was only one choice left. One gesture. Something that would seal the end of one cycle and pave the way for another. And that moment, he knew, was coming. The moment when he would put a definitive end to it, not with anger, not with revenge, but with the awareness of someone who had survived his worst pain. And had chosen to live. For real. The days began to have a different rhythm, as if a new beat guided Anthony's steps. The mornings were no longer marked by anxiety and the nights no longer carried that weight on his chest. He still thought about everything that had happened, yes, but from a more distant, almost analytical place. There were no more emotional outbursts, just a kind of sad but serene understanding. For the first time since the collapse of his married life, he felt that he was rebuilding himself not to prove something, but to exist in a lighter way. Elena followed this process with the naturalness of someone who knew that healing someone means walking alongside them and not trying to pull them out of the abyss. She didn't press for definitions, she didn't demand promises. She was present, and that was more than enough. Still, Anthony felt that something inside him needed to be resolved before he could move on completely. Something still pending. A part of his history that needed to be visited not out of anger, but out of a need for liberation. It was early autumn when he decided to revisit the house where they lived. He hadn't been back there since he left with the small suitcase and the prolonged silence. The property had been for sale for months, but no one was interested. Perhaps because the house, so steeped in memories, seemed to carry within its walls an unfinished story. He told the broker he wanted to get in before it sold. He arrived alone, opened the gate that was already creaking slightly and walked to the door as if he were returning to a sacred and abandoned place. The key still worked. As he turned it, the smell of wood, forgotten books, and stopped time hit him like a warm breath. It was strange. Everything remained as he remembered, but at the same time nothing seemed to have the same energy. It was a house where love once lived, but now it only bore witness to the memory of what it was. He walked through the rooms in silence. He ran his finger along the shelves, touched the edges of the photographs that were still on the sideboard, sat down in the armchair he usually occupied during his evenings of reading. There, he saw himself from months ago, naive, hopeful, believing that love was enough. He went up to the room. The bed was made, as if waiting for a return that would never come. The sheets had been changed, but the mattress still bore the marks of a body resting in memories. He walked to the closet and opened the empty doors. Just a forgotten hanger. And it was there, in that empty space, that Anthony sat on the floor and cried. Not out of anger, nor out of longing. But realizing he was ready to say goodbye. Ready to leave that house behind as a chapter that closes not with anger, but with respect for what it represented. When he went downstairs, he found an envelope on the dining room table. He recognized the handwriting. Claire had left another letter. Unlike the previous one, this one was shorter. It said only that she had signed all the necessary documents for the sale of the house and that she wanted him to be able to say goodbye to the place in any way he needed. At the end, a sentence that asked for nothing but said everything: "I hope you find peace wherever it may be. I continue to try to find mine." Anthony folded the letter carefully, put it in his pocket and, before leaving, turned off all the lights with ritualistic care. When he closed the door, he didn't look back. Not out of pride. But because he knew that what he needed to see was already with him, inside, sewn between wounds that were now healing. That night, he met Elena for dinner. A new, cozy restaurant, hidden away in streets that only those who know it well know how to find. They sat by the window, and for the first time, Anthony spoke about the past without pain in his voice. He told him about the visit to the house, about the letter, about what he felt when he found his own absence in that place. Elena listened to him attentively, holding his hand with discreet firmness. When he finished, she simply said that she was proud of him. And at that moment, he realized that he had never heard those words so simply and so profoundly. He smiled, not as if thanking her, but as if he finally believed. On the way home, walking under the timid light of the streetlights, she stopped, turned to him and asked if he would allow himself to be happy again. Anthony did not answer right away. He simply hugged her tightly, like someone who finds shelter after a long time lost in the cold. Meanwhile, Claire was going through her own process. Having sold the house, he moved to a small apartment, far from the old neighborhood. I wanted anonymity, I wanted to start over without being observed. People still whispered when she passed certain places, and she knew that kind of judgment wasn't going away anytime soon. But he wasn't trying to hide. I kept going to the market, the bakery, the newsstand. She politely greeted anyone who looked at her sideways and smiled at anyone who looked away. I had learned, the hard way possible, that guilt does not dissolve in time, but transforms into conscience. I attended therapy sessions, read books on emotional reconciliation, wrote in diaries that would never be read by anyone. He was not seeking social redemption. He was trying to understand himself. She knew she wouldn't have Anthony again, and even though she still loved him, she accepted that the love that destroys doesn't deserve to be rekindled. One day, while organizing the studio papers, he found a folder with old photos. Trips, dinners, simple moments that now seemed to belong to another life. Among them, one specific image caught his attention, the two of them in front of the old house, holding a "sold" sign with a smile that overflowed with hope. Claire looked at that photo for long minutes. Then he put it back in the folder, closed it and wrote the word "end" in red pen. Not out of hate. But because I finally understood that moving forward wasn't about erasing, but accepting that not everything that starts well needs to last forever. The following week, Anthony received an unexpected invitation, a photography exhibition signed by Elena, entitled Visible Scars. The event would be in a small but respected cultural space. He arrived discreetly, wearing the jacket he hadn't worn since the night he confronted Claire. The paintings were elegantly arranged. Each image told a story of pain, overcoming and transformation. Ordinary people in fragile moments, but illuminated by an invisible force. In one of the frames, a photograph of him. With his back turned, in front of the old house, on a cloudy afternoon. Elena had photographed him without him noticing. The caption was a simple sentence: "Some men don't leave ruins, they build gardens on them." Anthony stood for a moment before that image. He took a deep breath. He smiled. When Elena approached, he pulled her close and told her he was ready. That if she wanted, they could stop walking beside each other and, perhaps, start walking together. She didn't respond with words. She just held his hand tighter. And in that gesture was everything he needed to know. They weren't trying to forget their history. They were, together, building a new one. Made not of perfection, but of awareness. Of choice. Of love born of pain, but cultivated in truth. And that, he knew now, was stronger than any past. The end of that photographic exhibition was not just the closing of an artistic show, it was also the last page of what Anthony considered the densest chapter of his story. He and Elena left the space hand in hand, but with firm and conscious steps, as if they no longer needed to look back to justify their own pain. They had chosen, together, to walk towards something new, with their eyes wide open, without erasing what each of them had experienced before. The reunion with tranquility did not come in the form of euphoria, nor eternal vows, but rather in the solidity of small gestures, making coffee for each other, leaving notes on the fridge, discussing old films and laughing without the weight of a past that required explanations. Anthony finally realized that true love is not the kind that screams about its existence, but the kind that remains even when the world is silent. Work gradually returned. He accepted an invitation to work as a consultant for a social impact startup, where he used all his experience not for corporate profit, but to develop projects that helped small entrepreneurs stay strong in crisis scenarios. The irony was clear: after having had everything, after losing everything, he was now helping people who were on the verge of losing it too. And this role, more than any previous position, made sense. He no longer sought status, he sought meaning. At home, Elena photographed portraits of survival, women who had gone through abusive relationships, men who had gotten back on their feet after losing their children, young people who had given up addictions and rebuilt their identity. Their home was a constant celebration of the possibility of starting over, but without denying the pain that had brought them there. Claire, on the other hand, found a much more bitter ending, but one that was consistent with her choices. The studio went bankrupt after losing the few contracts that still sustained its finances. Her name became synonymous with scandal in the circles that had previously applauded her. Little by little, she was forced to reinvent herself in silence. She tried to work as an assistant at a smaller agency, but faced resistance from colleagues and distrust from clients. The days became longer, the nights more introspective. There were no longer many friends around. Even among family members, the relationship was marked by a mixture of compassion and disappointment. She continued to live alone, writing letters that she did not send, reflecting on choices that she could not undo. One day, she decided to gather the diaries she had been writing since the separation and sent them, anonymously, to a blog that published real chronicles about emotional reconstruction. The text was published with the title, "When You Love and Hurt at the Same Time." It went viral. Readers were divided between empathy and indignation. Many cried, others condemned. But Claire, reading the comments, felt something different for the first time, the certainty that she could not change the past, but perhaps she still had something to offer as a witness to what pain can teach. The man with whom Claire had a brief and devastating affair, the one that began with revenge and ended in regret, disappeared from the scene. After losing his job and being exposed as part of a corporate scandal, he tried to start over in another city, under a different professional name. But the digital world is unforgiving. His face was featured in search results linked to betrayal and the destruction of a marriage. For a time, he worked temporary jobs, without stability, moving from state to state. He became depressed, was hospitalized after a breakdown, and there, in the stuffy room of a modest psychiatric clinic, he wrote a letter that he never sent. In it, he said he didn't know if he would ever be forgiven, but that he now understood that revenge is a trap that swallows the perpetrator himself. That there was no victory when the price was one's own dignity. The couple's old house, which for a long time remained a symbol frozen in time, ended up being bought by a young couple who were expecting their first child. The house was renovated, the outside painted, the garden replanted with new flowers. No one there knew the story, but perhaps they felt something in the air, not like a curse, but like a distant memory that this place had known both love and destruction. And now, it was fertile ground for other stories to be born. A few months later, Anthony and Elena traveled to the countryside, where they spent a weekend without cell phones, without commitments, just living in the present. At a secluded and surrounded by mountains, he took a small box, where he kept Claire's letters, some old photos and a gold wedding ring. In front of a bonfire, in silence, he burned everything. Elena respected the moment. He didn't ask, he just stood by her side, holding her hand tightly. He cried little. Because there was no more pain. Just the need to close the cycle with a symbolic gesture. Seeing the flames consume the remains of the past, he felt lighter, like someone who had finally made it through winter and was now stepping onto the damp earth of spring. Their story did not turn into a fairy tale. It was not marked by twists and turns that undo what hurt. But it was true. And that was more than enough. Anthony understood that the greatest act of love one can have for oneself is to not remain where there is no respect. That forgiving is not forgetting, but freeing ourselves from the invisible chain that binds us to those who no longer deserve us. And starting over doesn't mean replacing one love with another, but rather opening up space within yourself to be loved in a new, healthier, more real way. And Claire, even though alone, even though silently, began to walk in another direction. Time, which at first seemed like her enemy, began to work in her favor. She began to write frequently, not only about herself, but about other stories she knew. She became an anonymous author of stories that touched her readers deeply. People didn't know who was behind them, but they felt that there was truth in the words. And this truth, even though it came from pain, began to build a new purpose. It was a way of giving back to the world something that the past had tried to take away from her, meaning. Now that you've come this far, tell us, what did you think of this story? Have you ever experienced something similar? What would you choose if you were in Anthony's shoes? Or Claire's? Leave your opinion in the comments, we really want to know what you think. And of course, if you liked this story and want to hear others that are just as intense, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every week, you will find real or fictional narratives that show the power of human emotions. And remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. The stories told here have the sole purpose of reflecting on the devastating consequences that disloyalty can cause in people's lives. May each narrative serve as a reflection, and not as encouragement. Until next time.